What if the room everyone trusted most, the one sealed tight with a key turned from the inside, was the very thing deceiving them all? And what if the truth had been standing quietly in the corner the entire time, reflected, but never truly seen? The afternoon Miss Marple arrived at Ravencrest Manor carried the kind of stillness that made even the birds seem hesitant, as though the estate itself were holding its breath, and she noticed it immediately, smiling to herself in that gentle, almost amused way of hers, because silence, she had long observed, often made the most noise of all. The great house rose before her with polite arrogance, all stone and ivy and inherited confidence, and yet something about the windows unsettled her, the way they caught the light too eagerly, too cleanly, like eyes that never blinked. And as she stepped inside, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, she felt that familiar sensation she had learned to trust over decades of village tragedies and whispered confessions, the feeling that something here was pretending very hard to be ordinary. Edward Dunbar, the man whose death had summoned her from her quiet routines, had been found alone in his study, door locked, key inside, heart stopped in his chest as neatly as a clock wound down, and the police, quite pleased with themselves, had declared it a natural death, complicated only by unfortunate timing. But Miss Marple had heard that sort of confidence before, heard it in voices that laughed later when they realized how wrong they had been. Ha ha! And she could not help but think how strange it was that certainty always arrived before understanding. Inspector Slack met her with an expression that suggested patience was being rationed carefully, his boots loud against the floor, his tone clipped as he explained what had already been explained far too often, that there were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no reason to suspect foul play. And Miss Marple listened politely, nodding, hands folded, eyes drifting not to him, but to the long mirror opposite the staircase, where his reflection seemed just a fraction slower than his movements, a trick of the light, perhaps, or perhaps not, and she felt a small stirring of interest that warmed her like a cup of good tea. The study itself was everything one might expect of a man who collected art and secrets with equal enthusiasm. Dark wood, heavy curtains, shelves that looked impressive without necessarily being read, and yet Miss Marple's gaze was drawn again and again to the shattered mirror resting carefully in a box on the desk, its fragments glinting softly like broken smiles, and she felt a little ache then, because broken things always made her think of people who had trusted the wrong reflection. Edward Dunbar, she learned, had been a man of enthusiasm and excess, deeply invested in the past, particularly the theatrical past, a man who believed that cleverness could outwit consequence. Ah! And Miss Marple had seen enough of such men to know how often that belief ended poorly. The servants hovered nearby, their faces carefully arranged into appropriate sorrow. But sorrow, Miss Marple knew, was a complicated emotion, and it rarely wore the same face twice. The gardener lingered at a distance, eyes lowered, hands rough and restless, while the butler, Collins, moved with exact precision, each step measured, each gesture polished to perfection. And Miss Marple watched him the way one watched a clock, not because it moved, but because it moved exactly when expected. Lady Patricia Dunbar, pale and trembling despite her rigid posture, spoke of Edward's excitement in recent weeks, of discoveries made in forgotten corners of the estate, of mirrors uncovered and cleaned and studied as though they held the answers to life itself. And Miss Marple listened kindly, offering murmurs of sympathy that sounded like comfort but carried the weight of observation beneath them, because excitement, she had learned, was often the prelude to recklessness.
As the afternoon wore on, light shifted across the room, sliding along the walls, climbing the shelves, brushing against the mirrors with a tenderness that felt almost intimate, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to the window, tilting her head slightly, noticing how the garden house aligned perfectly with the study at a particular angle, and she felt a small thrill then, the kind she rarely admitted to herself, because it meant a puzzle was beginning to take shape. Inspector Slack dismissed her quiet questions with practiced irritation, insisting again that there was nothing mysterious about a man dying alone, locked in his own room, but Miss Marple smiled, because locked rooms had always been terribly talkative in her experience, and they rarely kept their secrets for long when listened to properly. She wandered the house with gentle curiosity, her presence almost forgettable, which suited her perfectly, and everywhere she went she noticed mirrors, more than seemed strictly necessary, placed in hallways, corners, near windows, catching fragments of movement and light, and she thought of village fêtes and stage tricks, of how easy it was to guide an audience's attention where you wanted it, while the real work happened elsewhere. A maid passed her in the corridor, eyes wide, hands clasped too tightly, and Miss Marple felt a sudden pinch of concern, because fear, she had noticed, always revealed itself in the smallest gestures, a pause too long, a breath held too sharply, and she wondered what the girl had seen, or thought she had seen, reflected somewhere she hadn't meant to look. By the time evening settled over Ravencrest Manor, the house seemed heavier, shadows pooling in corners, reflections deepening, and Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, knitting absent-mindedly, her needles clicking softly like a heartbeat, while conversations drifted around her, bits of gossip, fragments of grief, laughter that arrived too suddenly and stopped just as fast, and she felt that familiar mixture of sadness and anticipation, because death always left ripples, and ripples always led somewhere. She thought of Edward Dunbar alone in his study, the last thing he might have seen before his heart betrayed him, and she felt a curious chill, not of fear, but of recognition, because there were deaths caused by violence, and then there were deaths caused by understanding something too late. As the fire crackled and the mirrors caught its glow, doubling and redoubling the flames until the room seemed alive with movement, Miss Marple lifted her eyes and met her own reflection, small, unassuming, easily overlooked, and she smiled softly, because she knew, as she always had, that people rarely feared what looked harmless, and that was precisely why the truth so often revealed itself to her, in the end, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone who knew how to look not at the room, but at what the room was trying so hard to hide. Why was it that every time Miss Marple's gentle eyes drifted toward the mirrors, the people of Ravencrest Manor seemed to glance away, as though polished glass had suddenly become something indecent, something dangerous, something that might laugh back at them if stared at too long? The morning after her arrival unfolded with deceptive calm, the kind that pretended nothing terrible had happened, while every sound carried just a little too far, and Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting resting forgotten in her lap, observed how the household moved around its grief with careful choreography, each person stepping precisely where they believed they were safest, and never, if it could be helped, directly in front of a reflective surface. She noticed it first with the maid who brought the tea, how the girl angled her body away from the tall mirror near the sideboard, eyes fixed stubbornly on the tray, as if looking up might invite trouble, and Miss Marple felt a small tightening in her chest, because avoidance was rarely random, and fear had a way of settling into habits.
Inspector Slack, full of renewed confidence after a night's rest, strode in and out of rooms with loud certainty, declaring that the case was as good as closed, that hearts failed all the time, that people were too eager for mystery. And Miss Marple listened with polite attention, while quietly watching how his reflection stretched and bent in the hallway mirror as he passed, his head momentarily misaligned with his shoulders in a way that would have amused her under different circumstances, if it hadn't carried such a peculiar sense of wrongness. She took a slow walk through the house, her steps unhurried, her presence nearly invisible, and she listened, because houses spoke when you allowed them, through creaking floors, through the way doors preferred to be opened, through the placement of furniture that suggested habits formed long before tragedy arrived. In the breakfast room, Lady Patricia sat stiffly, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved, her eyes darting to the mirror above the mantel only when she thought no one was looking, and Miss Marple caught that fleeting glance, the way one might glance at a darkened window at night, half expecting to see someone staring back. Margaret Dunbar entered soon after, her grief worn like a carefully chosen coat, suitable, respectable, and Miss Marple felt a flicker of sympathy, because grief, when mixed with obligation, often left no room for honesty, and she wondered what Margaret feared more, the memory of her husband or the future without him. Conversation turned, as it often did, to Edward's peculiar interests, his fascination with old performances, illusions, mirrors that promised wonder and delivered unease. And Miss Marple smiled faintly as Lady Patricia described how Edward would move furniture inches at a time, insisting the light wasn't right, that the reflection needed correcting, that everything depended on timing. And Miss Marple thought of church fetes where mirrors were used to make tents look larger, where children shrieked with laughter at seeing themselves distorted, never suspecting how easily delight could tip into alarm. The gardener, Thomas Fletcher, appeared briefly at the doorway, hat in hand, his face weathered and sincere, but his eyes never lifted beyond the floor, and Miss Marple noticed how he positioned himself carefully between two windows rather than in front of either, and she felt that quiet click of understanding begin to turn, because people rarely chose their spots without reason. Later, as she wandered toward the conservatory, Miss Marple encountered Collins, the butler, polishing a mirror with meticulous care, his movements smooth, economical, precise, and she watched how he adjusted his stance ever so slightly to catch the light just right, how his reflection seemed perfectly aligned, never distorted, never awkward, and something about that perfection unsettled her more than fear ever could, because perfection often required effort. They exchanged polite words, nothing of consequence, and yet Miss Marple felt the faintest ripple of tension beneath his composure, like a string pulled tight, and she wondered how long he had practiced standing exactly where he stood. The conservatory itself was a riot of glass and greenery, sunlight streaming in from all sides, reflections overlapping reflections, until it was difficult to tell where one thing ended and another began, and Miss Marple paused there, struck by a sudden sense of dizziness that made her steady herself against a chair, because too many angles could confuse even the most sensible person. And she thought of Edward Dunbar, alone in his study, surrounded by polished surfaces, watching light behave in ways it shouldn't. As the day wore on, news arrived that the maid, Alice Bennet, had been found dead near the garden house, her fall dismissed almost immediately as an accident, and the household reacted with the kind of shock that felt rehearsed, gasps arriving a second too late, tears that didn't quite reach the eyes, and Miss Marple felt something heavy settle in her chest, because coincidence was a lazy word people used when they didn't wish to look closer.
She accompanied Inspector Slack to the garden house, her small figure dwarfed by ivy-covered walls,
And she noticed how the building aligned with the study window, how the path between them formed a neat corridor of sight, and she imagined standing in one place and seeing another without truly being seen, and the thought made her shiver. Inspector Slack scoffed at her questions, waved away her interest in angles and sunlight, insisting that mirrors were mirrors and death was death. But Miss Marple smiled gently, because she had long known that people underestimated what they didn't bother to understand. Inside the garden house, dust motes danced in the light, old frames leaned against walls, and a faint scent of polish lingered, and Miss Marple knelt slowly, peering at the floor, noticing scuff marks that suggested careful movement rather than careless cleaning. And she felt a pang of sadness then, thinking of Alice Bennet, young, diligent, likely proud of her work, and she wondered what reflection had stopped her heart before the fall ever did. That evening, back in the manor, Miss Marple sat quietly as conversations fractured into whispers, fear creeping into voices despite attempts at calm. And she watched how people positioned themselves instinctively, chairs angled away from mirrors, backs turned, reflections avoided. And she thought how strange it was that a house filled with beauty could inspire such discomfort. She laughed softly at one point, a small sound that startled those nearby, and when asked what amused her, she merely said she had been reminded of a village pantomime where everyone was frightened of a fake ghost until they realized it was their own shadow. Ha ha! And the laughter that followed was thin, uncertain, fading too quickly. As night settled, Miss Marple retired with her thoughts, her mind turning over images of light and glass, of fear and precision, of a house designed not just to be lived in, but to be seen through. And she felt that peculiar blend of excitement and sorrow that always accompanied the approach of truth, because truth, she knew, rarely arrived without leaving something broken behind. She lay awake, listening to the house breathe, the faint creak of beams, the whisper of curtains, the distant echo of footsteps that might have been memory or might not. And she thought again of the mirrors, of how everyone avoided them except one man who polished them obsessively, and she smiled into the darkness, because when everyone feared the same thing, the answer was often hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone willing to look straight into it and ask not what they saw, but why they were so afraid of seeing it at all. What if the most important witness never spoke a single word? And what if her silence screamed louder than any confession ever could? Miss Marple asked herself this question as dawn crept gently over Ravencrest Manor, painting the windows pale gold while the house still clung to its unease. And she sat upright in her narrow bed long before breakfast was announced, because once a thought took root in her mind, it rarely allowed her the comfort of rest. Alice Bennet's death weighed heavily on her, not merely because it followed Edward Dunbar's so closely, but because it carried the unmistakable scent of interruption, as though a sentence had been cut off mid-word, and Miss Marple had always believed that unfinished sentences were the most revealing of all. She dressed carefully, smoothing her cardigan, pinning her brooch just so, and smiled at her reflection in the small mirror of her room, noticing how it softened her features, made her look harmless, almost laughable, and she thought how fortunate it was that people so often mistook gentleness for ignorance. The household gathered for breakfast in a subdued hush, chairs scraping softly, cups clinking too loudly, and Miss Marple observed everything,
the way Margaret Dunbar's eyes flicked toward the empty space where Alice would have stood, the way Lady Patricia's hands trembled just slightly as she lifted her spoon, the way Collins poured tea with his usual precision, his movements flawless, unhurried, as though nothing in the world had shifted at all. Miss Marple listened as Inspector Slack summarized the findings with weary impatience, calling Alice's death a tragic accident, a slip on damp ground, an unfortunate coincidence, and she felt a wave of sadness wash over her, because coincidence was such a convenient word, one that spared people the discomfort of curiosity. After breakfast, she asked in her mild, almost apologetic way if she might see Alice's room, and though the request caused a ripple of discomfort, it was granted, because refusing Miss Marple somehow felt more suspicious than indulging her. The room was small, neat, everything in its place, a pair of shoes lined carefully by the bed, a folded sweater on the chair, and Miss Marple felt her throat tighten a little, because such order spoke of someone who took pride in her work, someone who noticed details, someone who would not have missed something unusual for long. She ran her fingers lightly along the window-sill, noting faint traces of polish, and she smiled sadly, imagining Alice wiping away fingerprints, adjusting angles, making things shine, unaware that clarity could be dangerous. On the bedside table lay a small hand mirror, its surface slightly cloudy from age, and Miss Marple picked it up gently, tilting it toward the light, watching how the room bent and shifted within it, and she wondered what Alice had seen reflected there that made her heart race so fiercely. Miss Marple left the room with a quiet nod of thanks and made her way toward the servants' staircase, her mind already weaving possibilities, because fear, she knew, rarely came from imagination alone. It was usually invited by experience. Outside, the morning air was crisp, birdsong tentative, and she walked slowly toward the garden house, accompanied by Thomas Fletcher, whose face carried a kind of resigned honesty, the look of a man who had learned that silence sometimes spoke for him whether he wished or not. He spoke of Alice in halting sentences, of her diligence, her habit of humming softly while she worked, a little tune that had stuck in his head and now returned unbidden, making his chest ache, and Miss Marple listened kindly, her heart softening, because grief often revealed the truest stories. As they approached the garden house, Miss Marple paused, adjusting her hat, and asked Thomas to stand exactly where Alice might have stood while cleaning, and he did so, awkwardly, uncertain, and she watched how the sunlight filtered through the trees, how it struck the glass panes, how reflections from the manor windows danced faintly across the garden house wall, and she felt a strange flutter of understanding begin to take shape. She moved a few steps to the side, then another, adjusting her position with small, careful movements, until suddenly something aligned, and she gasped softly, not in fear, but in recognition, because for a fleeting moment she saw it, the way the study window reflected into the garden house mirror, creating a layered image that felt wrong, unsettling, as though reality had slipped sideways. Thomas shifted uneasily, his face paling, and Miss Marple knew then that Alice must have stood here, cloth in hand, wiping diligently, and in that precise moment, at that precise angle, she had seen something she wasn't meant to see, something that made her laugh nervously at first, because surely it couldn't be real, and then made her heart pound as understanding crept in. Miss Marple thanked Thomas and returned to the manor, her mind alive with possibilities, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts, because she had always believed that puzzles, no matter how grim, deserved patience rather than panic. Inside, the house felt different now, as though it sensed it was being understood, and she moved through corridors with new awareness, noticing how mirrors faced each other at deliberate angles, how light traveled along carefully planned paths, and she thought of Edward Dunbar, hunched over sketches and measurements, his excitement growing, his caution perhaps lagging behind.
She recalled Lady Patricia's stories of Edward's obsession, his insistence that the illusion was almost perfect, that he was close, so very close, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sorrow because obsession had a way of blinding people to the danger of success. That afternoon, she sat with Margaret Dunbar in the small sitting room, offering comfort in the form of shared silence, and when Margaret finally spoke, her voice breaking just slightly, Miss Marple felt tears prick her own eyes, because sorrow was contagious when allowed to breathe. Margaret spoke of Edward's moods, his late nights, his sudden bursts of laughter when something clicked, his frustration when others failed to understand, and Miss Marple listened, nodding gently, asking only the smallest questions, the kind that felt harmless but opened doors all the same. When Margaret mentioned how Edward had once said the mirrors could make a man disappear without leaving the room, Miss Marple smiled faintly, because exaggeration often carried the seed of truth. Later, as evening approached, Miss Marple found herself alone in the study, Inspector Slack having reluctantly allowed her access, and she stood where Edward had stood, feeling the weight of the room press in around her, and she waited, because waiting, she knew, was sometimes the most active thing one could do. Slowly, as the sun dipped lower, the light shifted, creeping along the walls, touching the mirrors one by one, and Miss Marple felt her breath catch as reflections layered themselves in unsettling ways, creating angles that defied expectation, and she imagined Edward witnessing this, his heart already racing, his mind alight with triumph and fear. And she felt a deep, aching sadness, because brilliance, when paired with arrogance, so often invited disaster. She laughed softly to herself at one point, shaking her head, because it reminded her of a village boy who once scared himself silly with a shadow puppet he'd made, and yet this was no child's game, and the consequences were all too real. As darkness settled, Miss Marple left the study, her conclusions not yet complete, but her direction clear, and she paused in the hallway, catching sight of her reflection once more, small, composed, quietly determined, and she thought of Alice Bennet, of her careful hands and curious eyes, and she felt a swell of resolve, because Alice's silence demanded a voice, and Miss Marple intended to provide it. She retired for the night with a heavy heart and a steady mind, knowing now that the truth was not hidden in shadows or secrets alone, but in light itself, in what it revealed when it struck at just the wrong angle. And as she drifted into sleep, she knew with absolute certainty that Alice Bennet had not merely fallen, she had been frightened to death by a reflection that showed her a crime already committed, and one that would have remained perfect, locked and unquestioned, if not for the quiet persistence of an old woman who knew that mirrors, like people, always told the truth eventually, even if they laughed while doing it.
What if murder required no knife, no gun, no hand laid violently upon another, only patience, knowledge, and the sun itself waiting obediently in the sky? Miss Marple considered this as she took her morning tea in the smallest sitting-room of Ravencrest Manor, the only room blessedly free of mirrors, and she felt an almost childish relief at the absence, a quiet ha-ha escaping her lips at the thought that even an old house could overindulge in vanity.
Yet relief never lasted long when one's mind had already crossed a threshold, and hers had done so irrevocably. Alice Bennet's frightened face returned to her thoughts again and again, not as it had been found, but as it must have looked in that final moment of understanding, the moment when curiosity turned to dread, and Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest, because she had known that look before, in villagers who had realized too late that a harmless question had uncovered something monstrous. Lady Patricia joined her, looking older than she had days before, grief folding into her posture, and Miss Marple reached out, covering her hand with her own, a small gesture that carried more comfort than words ever could, and for a moment neither spoke, because silence sometimes did the weeping for you. Eventually, Lady Patricia spoke of Edward, of his brilliance as a child, of how mirrors had fascinated him even then, how he would angle hand mirrors to bounce sunlight across the walls, laughing in delight when it worked, and Miss Marple smiled sadly, because childhood wonder, when left unchecked, often grew into dangerous obsession. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered the corridors, walking slowly, deliberately, as though simply stretching her legs. Yet her eyes measured everything, the spacing between mirrors, the height at which they were mounted, the way light from the eastern windows slid across polished surfaces, and she felt that familiar hum of certainty building, the kind that arrived not with drama, but with quiet inevitability. She paused near the servants' passage, where Alice had worked so diligently, and she imagined the girl humming softly, unaware that every stroke of her cloth brought the house closer to perfection and herself closer to death. And Miss Marple swallowed hard, because there was something deeply cruel about a crime that relied on someone else's thoroughness. When Inspector Slack appeared, bristling with irritation at her presence in the hallway, Miss Marple greeted him warmly, asking after his comfort, his sleep, his impressions of the house, and she watched as his irritation softened just enough to let information slip, because irritation, she knew, made people careless. He spoke of measurements, of locked doors, of how nothing made sense if one insisted on seeing the murder weapon as something tangible, and Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, because she had once known a baker who searched for missing dough while the flour bag lay split at his feet. She suggested gently that perhaps the weapon had not been something one could hold, and Inspector Slack laughed, a short, dismissive sound, ha-ha, before shaking his head and muttering about fanciful theories, and she let him go, knowing that disbelief often walked hand in hand with revelation. That afternoon she asked Thomas Fletcher to accompany her once more to the garden house, and as they walked she spoke casually of weather, of seasons, of how gardeners understood light better than most, because plants lived or died by it, and Thomas nodded, thoughtful, and she saw respect flicker in his eyes, the kind reserved for those who noticed what others overlooked. Inside the garden house she positioned herself carefully, then asked Thomas to stand where Edward's study window aligned in the distance, and as the sun reached its slow descent, Miss Marple felt a shiver run through her, because the alignment sharpened, reflections stacking upon reflections, creating an image that felt both solid and impossible, and she knew with chilling clarity how Edward Dunbar had died. She imagined him seated, heart already strained by excitement or fear, looking up to see something that should not exist, his mind struggling to reconcile reality with perception, and she felt tears well, because death by confusion felt particularly cruel. She thanked Thomas and returned inside, her resolve firming with every step, and she sought out Margaret Dunbar, finding her alone in the music-room, fingers resting idly on piano keys she had not pressed since Edward's death, and Miss Marple sat beside her, speaking softly of grief, of how it distorted memory, and Margaret's composure finally cracked, her shoulders shaking, quiet sobs escaping despite her efforts to remain composed, and Miss Marple let her cry, because truth often followed tears. Margaret spoke then of Edward's secret excitement, of his insistence that the illusion could finally be perfected, that it would make him famous in a way the art collection never could. And Miss Marple listened, feeling both pity and frustration, because ambition so often wore the mask of destiny. When Margaret mentioned how Collins had encouraged Edward, praising his intellect, offering suggestions, Miss Marple felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, because encouragement, when paired with manipulation, became a powerful tool. As evening approached, Miss Marple retired to her room, spreading out notes she had kept only in her mind until now, arranging them carefully, because order soothed her thoughts, and she smiled faintly at the irony that mirrors had created chaos while simple paper brought clarity. She recalled the way Collins moved through the house, always aware of reflective surfaces, always positioned just so, and she felt a tightening resolve, because patterns once seen could not be unseen. Dinner passed in strained politeness, the clink of cutlery echoing too loudly, laughter forced and brittle, ha-has slipping out at the wrong moments, and Miss Marple watched as Collins refilled glasses, his reflection multiplying endlessly in the surrounding mirrors, and she wondered if he ever saw himself clearly any more. That night she stood once more at her window, watching the moonlight trace faint paths across the manor grounds, and she thought of Sebastian Veal, of Edward, of Alice, of how knowledge passed through generations like an inheritance, both precious and dangerous, and she felt a quiet sorrow settle over her, because brilliance without restraint so often demanded payment in blood. As she prepared for bed, she caught sight of her own reflection, small and steady, and she smiled, because she knew now that the truth did not hide in darkness at all. It hid in plain sight, in angles and light, and the assumption that no one would think to look there. And as she extinguished the lamp, she whispered a promise to the silence, that the light which had been used as a weapon would soon be turned against the one who wielded it, and that when the sun reached its proper height once more, Ravencrest Manor would finally be forced to see itself clearly, whether it wished to or not. What if the truth was never hidden at all, only bent just enough that anyone who glanced at it too quickly would look away in confusion? Miss Marple asked herself this as she walked the long corridor outside Edward Dunbar's study, her footsteps slow, deliberate, almost apologetic, as though she were merely stretching her legs rather than stepping closer to the heart of a murder. The house felt different now, not louder or quieter, but strained, like a held breath, and she found herself smiling faintly at the thought that even buildings could grow anxious when their secrets were close to being spoken aloud. She paused by a window and watched a cloud drift lazily across the sky, the sunlight dimming for just a moment, and she thought of timing, of how everything in life, from happiness to catastrophe, arrived only when conditions aligned just so. Inside the study, Inspector Slack stood hunched over a notebook, irritation etched into every line of his posture, and Miss Marple greeted him warmly, commenting on the pleasant weather, the view, the admirable proportions of the room, and she saw his shoulders relax just enough to betray his fatigue, because resistance was tiring work. He spoke of facts again, of locked doors and heart failure and tragic coincidence, and Miss Marple nodded kindly, allowing him the comfort of certainty, because people clung to it when they felt the ground shifting beneath them. She moved closer to the desk, running her fingers lightly along its edge, imagining Edward sitting there, his mind alive with excitement, his heart already racing, and she felt a sudden wave of sorrow because she suspected that in his final moment Edward had not felt fear so much as disbelief, a quiet, stunned realization that he had been outplayed by his own creation. Miss Marple asked if she might stand where Edward had stood, and though Inspector Slack rolled his eyes, he allowed it, because denying her small requests had begun to feel more troublesome than indulging them. She positioned herself carefully, then tilted her head, squinting slightly, and smiled to herself, ha, because from this exact spot the room told a very different story. She spoke then, softly, almost conversationally, about optical illusions, about how the brain filled gaps when reality failed to make sense, about how even intelligent people could be fooled if the trick was elegant enough. And Inspector Slack scoffed, but she noticed the way his pen slowed, his attention sharpening despite himself. She gestured toward the mirrors, suggesting they be left untouched until later, and he agreed with a dismissive wave, unaware that his indifference was precisely what allowed her theory to breathe. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Lady Patricia, finding her in the garden, staring absently at a rosebush Edward had once pruned with meticulous care, and she felt another pang of sympathy, because grief often attached itself to the smallest details. They spoke of Edward's charm, his stubbornness, his belief that he was on the verge of something extraordinary, and Miss Marple listened, her heart heavy, because greatness pursued without humility so often demanded a terrible price. Lady Patricia mentioned Collins then, how he had been Edward's most enthusiastic supporter, always praising his intellect, always encouraging him to push further, and Miss Marple smiled gently, because praise was a powerful currency, one that could buy trust far more easily than kindness. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the study alone, asking only that she not be disturbed, and she stood there patiently, waiting, because waiting was something she did very well. Slowly, as the sun dipped toward its appointed angle, the light shifted, reflections aligning with uncanny precision, and Miss Marple felt a chill pass through her, because now she could see it clearly, the illusion Edward had been so desperate to perfect. In the mirror opposite the desk, a reflection appeared that did not belong, an image that suggested absence where there should have been presence, a visual contradiction so unsettling that her own breath caught despite her preparedness, and she whispered softly, "Ah," because she could almost feel Edward's shock echoing through the room. She imagined his heart pounding, his mind racing, the sudden flood of adrenaline as his body reacted to what it could not explain, and she felt tears sting her eyes because the elegance of the deception made the death all the more tragic. She left the study quietly, her conclusions now solid, and found Margaret Dunbar waiting in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes searching, and Miss Marple took her hand gently, offering reassurance without explanation, because explanations sometimes needed the right moment to land safely. Margaret spoke of Edward's debts, of his desperation to secure a future, of how he believed the illusion would bring recognition and fortune, and Miss Marple listened, her heart aching, because ambition, when mixed with fear, could drive even good people into perilous territory.
That night, as dinner unfolded in strained politeness, Miss Marple observed Collins closely. The way he navigated reflective surfaces with unconscious ease, the way his gaze flicked not to people, but to angles, to light, to positioning, and she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest, because guilt often revealed itself not through panic, but through precision. When laughter bubbled awkwardly around the table, ha-ha, breaking the tension for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple smiled along, though her thoughts were far from amused, because she knew now that the killer's greatest confidence lay in the belief that no one else could possibly understand what had been done.
Later, alone in her room, Miss Marple arranged her thoughts carefully, piecing together motive, method, and opportunity with the calm satisfaction of a gardener setting seedlings in neat rows, and she smiled faintly, because order had returned at last. She thought of Alice Bennet again, of her careful hands and curious eyes, and she felt a surge of determination, because Alice's death had not been an accident, it had been a necessity, a silencing of truth, and Miss Marple could not allow such necessity to go unchallenged. As she extinguished the lamp, she glanced once more at her reflection, small and unassuming, and she felt a quiet strength settle over her, because she knew that the most dangerous lies were those reflected back at us as truth, and that soon, very soon, the reflection that had lied would be forced to reveal what it had hidden, no matter how carefully it had been angled to deceive.
What if the deadliest part of a crime was not the act itself, but the confidence that no one would ever think to look from the right place? Miss Marple pondered this as she stood alone in Ravencrest Manor's vast library, the air heavy with dust and history, the tall shelves rising like silent witnesses around her, and she felt a curious mixture of comfort and sorrow, because libraries had always been places where truth waited patiently to be found. Morning light filtered through the high windows, touching the spines of old volumes, and she smiled faintly at how Edward Dunbar had overlooked the simplest fact of all, that answers often lived in paper long before they appeared in practice. She moved slowly along the shelves, trailing her fingers across titles on optics, stagecraft, and antiquated theories of perception, and her heart beat just a little faster when she found the slim, worn book she had hoped for, its margins filled with careful notes in Edward's handwriting, calculations scratched and corrected, excitement practically humming from the page. She lowered herself into a chair, reading not just the words, but the intention behind them, and she felt a wave of sadness, because Edward had been so close to understanding, yet fatally unaware of how vulnerable curiosity could make a man when another guided it from the shadows. As she turned a page, a loose slip of paper fluttered free and landed at her feet, and she bent to retrieve it, her breath catching slightly when she saw the unfamiliar handwriting, sharper, more confident, not Edward's at all, listing angles, times, and positions with professional certainty, and she closed her eyes for a moment, because the final piece had slipped neatly into place. Collins. The name did not need to be written for her to know it. She thought of the way he moved through the house, of his reverence for symmetry, of his irritation when mirrors were disturbed, and she felt a quiet thrill of certainty that banished the lingering doubts, because doubt, once resolved, often felt like relief disguised as resolve. A sound at the doorway interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Inspector Slack hovering awkwardly, his skepticism worn thin by exhaustion, and she greeted him warmly, offering a chair, because hospitality disarmed more effectively than accusation. She spoke then, gently, about angles and light, about how the human mind reacted when confronted with something that violated expectation, and she watched as his frown deepened, not in disbelief this time, but in reluctant consideration, and she felt a small spark of satisfaction, because persuasion rarely arrived with drama. She invited him to stand where Edward had stood, to look where Edward had looked, and though he hesitated, curiosity finally won, and Miss Marple adjusted the curtains just enough to allow the light its intended path. When the reflection appeared, brief but unmistakable, Inspector Slack inhaled sharply, his bravado dissolving into stunned silence, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, because shock, when shared, often humbled the proudest of minds.
She explained then calmly how Edward's heart condition, exacerbated by stress and excitement, would have responded disastrously to such a sight, how the body, believing itself in mortal danger, could betray itself in a moment of terror. And Inspector Slack nodded slowly, the weight of understanding settling over him like a damp coat. They spoke of Alice Bennet then, of her diligence, of how she must have stumbled upon the same illusion by accident, and Miss Marple's voice softened, because speaking of the dead deserved gentleness, and she saw the regret flicker across the inspector's face, because mistakes, once recognized, were never easy to carry. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the grounds once more, her steps lighter now, because certainty lent confidence, and she found Thomas Fletcher by the garden house, his hands busy but his eyes watchful, and she spoke to him of what he had seen, of the angles he understood instinctively as a gardener, and he nodded, his expression grave, because truth, once named, demanded acknowledgment. He led her inside, showing her something he had hesitated to mention before, a small vial tucked carefully behind an old mirror, and Miss Marple felt a chill because she recognized its purpose immediately, and the cruelty of its necessity made her throat tighten. She thanked him, her voice steady despite the heaviness in her chest, because gratitude mattered most when it cost something to give.
As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the manor, her mind already shaping the final act, and she felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind that came not from victory, but from inevitability. At dinner, she observed Collins more closely than ever, noting the faint tension in his posture, the way his eyes tracked the light as the sun dipped lower, and she felt a quiet certainty, because predators often sensed when the hunt turned against them. When laughter surfaced awkwardly at the table, ha-has echoing too brightly against the heavy mood, Miss Marple smiled politely, though her thoughts were already elsewhere, mapping positions, timing, the careful orchestration required to reveal the truth without chaos. Later, alone in her room, she wrote a brief note, precise and polite, requesting everyone's presence in the study the following afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, and she smiled faintly, because formality had a way of masking intention. She folded the note neatly, setting it aside, and looked out the window toward the garden house, where shadows lengthened and the mirrors slept quietly, and she felt a swell of resolve, because justice, like light, required the correct angle to be seen clearly. As she prepared for bed, she thought of Edward's eager scribbles, of Alice's careful hands, of how knowledge could uplift or destroy, depending on who wielded it, and she closed her eyes with a heavy but determined heart, knowing that the final illusion was nearly ready, and that tomorrow Ravencrest Manor would be forced to confront the angle no one had thought to measure, the one that turned reflection into revelation and deception into undeniable truth. What if the truth only appeared for a heartbeat, and missing that single moment meant believing a lie forever? Miss Marple held this thought close as the afternoon crept toward 4 o'clock, the manor strangely hushed, as though the walls themselves had agreed to listen. She sat quietly in the drawing-room, hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and unremarkable, yet inside her mind every detail was aligned with careful precision, because this was not a confrontation that could survive haste. One by one they gathered in the study exactly as requested, Margaret Dunbar with her composure worn thin at the edges, Lady Patricia pale and restless, Inspector Slack attempting an air of authority that did little to disguise his unease, and finally Collins, impeccably dressed, his posture controlled, his eyes already flicking toward the windows despite his efforts to appear unconcerned.
Miss Marple greeted them warmly, commenting on the weather, on the agreeable hour of the day, even offering a small joke that drew a brief, brittle laugh, a ha-ha, slipping out before anyone quite realized they needed it, and she sensed the tension loosen just enough to make what followed all the more devastating. She asked them to stand where Edward had stood, to look where Edward had looked, and though there was some murmured protest, curiosity again proved stronger than caution, because people were rarely immune to the promise of understanding. Miss Marple adjusted the curtains with a gentle tug, allowing the late afternoon sun to spill into the room at the exact angle she had measured so carefully, and the air seemed to thicken, anticipation settling like dust motes caught in a beam of light. At first, nothing happened, and she let the silence stretch, because silence was often the sharpest tool. And then, just as doubt began to creep in, the reflection shifted. A gasp escaped Margaret's lips, sharp and involuntary, as an image appeared in the mirror that made no sense to the eye, a presence where absence should have been, a distortion so subtle yet so wrong that it unsettled the mind before the reason could catch up. Miss Marple watched Collins closely then, saw the color drain from his face, saw his jaw tighten just a fraction too late, and she felt a quiet sadness, because guilt often revealed itself in moments of reflex rather than confession. Inspector Slack stepped forward instinctively, his breath shallow, his skepticism shattered, and Miss Marple spoke calmly, explaining how Edward had seen this same impossible image, how his heart, already fragile, would have reacted with fatal speed. And she felt a hush fall over the room, heavy and oppressive, as understanding took root. She spoke next of Alice Bennet, of her careful nature, of how she must have noticed the same anomaly by accident, and a tremor passed through the room, because death multiplied carried a different weight, and Lady Patricia covered her mouth, tears slipping free despite her effort to remain composed, a sob breaking through the stillness like a quiet plea. Miss Marple turned then to Collins, her voice gentle rather than accusatory, and she described the notes in Edward's book, the unfamiliar handwriting, the vial hidden behind the mirror, and she watched as his composure finally fractured, the precise angles of his confidence collapsing into something raw and exposed.
He spoke then, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a weary bitterness that filled the room, admitting how Edward's obsession had grown, how praise had turned to pressure, how the illusion had seemed harmless until it wasn't. And Miss Marple listened, her heart heavy, because understanding a motive did not soften its consequences. As his words spilled out, anger flickered briefly across his face, followed by something like regret, and when his voice broke, the sound carried through the study with an intimacy that made even Inspector Slack look away. Miss Marple felt tears sting her own eyes, because there was tragedy on every side now, tragedy born not of malice alone, but of unchecked pride and fear. And she allowed the silence to return, giving everyone space to sit with what had been revealed. The light continued its slow journey across the room, the reflection fading as subtly as it had appeared, and Miss Marple felt a profound stillness settle over her, because the truth had been seen, and seeing it could not be undone. Inspector Slack moved to take Collins aside, his voice steady but subdued, and as Collins was led away, his gaze lingered on the mirror one last time, a look of disbelief and sorrow mingling there, and Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, because even justice carried a weight.
When the room finally emptied, she remained behind, alone with the fading light, and she thought of Edward's excitement, Alice's quiet diligence, of how easily brilliance could become blind, and she felt a deep, aching compassion, because human frailty was the truest constant she knew. She straightened the curtains gently, restoring the room to its ordinary appearance, and smiled faintly, because the illusion, stripped of its power, was now just glass and light again. And as she stepped out into the corridor, she knew that the final chapter was not about revelation, but about reckoning, about what remained once the moment the light refused to obey had passed, leaving behind only truth and the consequences it demanded. What do you see when the trick is finished, when the mirrors fall silent and the room returns to pretending nothing ever happened? Miss Marple asked herself this as she stood once more in the now ordinary study, the late afternoon having surrendered to evening, the light softer, kinder, almost apologetic, as though the house itself wished to make amends. The mirrors reflected nothing more than furniture and tired faces now, and she felt a curious emptiness settle in her chest, because endings, even just ones, always carried a quiet grief. Inspector Slack returned briefly, his manner subdued, his earlier bluster replaced by something closer to humility, and he thanked her in an awkward, roundabout way that made her smile, a ha-ha escaping her before she could stop it, because gratitude often sounded clumsy when it was sincere. He spoke of paperwork, of explanations that would satisfy the authorities, of how the case would be remembered, and Miss Marple listened politely, though her thoughts were elsewhere, drifting toward those who would carry the deeper consequences long after official conclusions were filed away. When he left, she found Margaret Dunbar waiting near the window, her shoulders slumped, her eyes red from tears she no longer tried to hide, and Miss Marple took her hand, squeezing gently, offering comfort without words, because words sometimes failed where presence did not. Margaret spoke haltingly of Edward's dreams, of how alive he had seemed when speaking of his work, of how she had loved that spark even when it frightened her, and Miss Marple felt her own eyes grow damp, because loving someone meant accepting both their light and the shadows it cast. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the quiet punctuated only by the distant sound of a clock ticking steadily onward. And Miss Marple thought of time, of how it marched forward without regard for human sorrow, yet somehow softened its edges as it went. Later, in the garden, Miss Marple encountered Thomas Fletcher, who tipped his hat respectfully, relief evident in his posture now that the truth had surfaced, and she thanked him again, because courage often appeared in the smallest, most overlooked places. He spoke of Alice Bennet then, his voice low, and Miss Marple felt a familiar ache, because Alice's absence lingered like a missing note in a melody, subtle yet unmistakable, and she promised quietly that Alice's diligence would not be forgotten, that her life had mattered, and the sincerity of that promise settled heavily but firmly within her. As dusk deepened, Lady Patricia approached, her elegance dulled by exhaustion, and she confessed her own regrets, her encouragement of Edward's obsession, her failure to question where it might lead, and Miss Marple listened without judgment, because blame, when shared honestly, often transformed into responsibility. The manor slowly began to breathe again, the tension that had coiled through its halls loosening at last, and Miss Marple felt a gentle satisfaction, not of triumph, but of closure, because harmony, once restored, was a quiet gift. That night, as she packed her small suitcase, she paused before the mirror in her room, studying her reflection with thoughtful eyes, and she smiled softly, because she knew better than most how easily appearances misled, how truth demanded patience, curiosity, and compassion in equal measure. She thought of Edward, of Alice, of Collins, of how each had been undone or defined by what they believed they were seeing, and she felt tears slide freely now, not from shock or fear, but from understanding, because understanding always arrived with its own ache. In the morning, Miss Marple departed Ravencrest Manor as quietly as she had arrived, the house standing calm and unremarkable behind her, its secrets spent, its illusions powerless, and as the car carried her away, she reflected on the nature of human deception, on how people built mirrors not only of glass, but of hope, pride, and fear, then trusted them far too completely. She smiled faintly at the thought that the world would continue producing such puzzles, such moments where truth hid just out of sight, waiting for someone willing to look twice, to wait for the right light, to ask the inconvenient question. And she felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over her, because curiosity, guided by kindness, remained one of the few forces capable of cutting through illusion. As the road curved away and Ravencrest disappeared from view, Miss Marple leaned back, closing her eyes, the rhythm of motion soothing her, and she carried with her not the satisfaction of having solved a crime, but the deeper, quieter knowledge that truth, once revealed, demanded remembrance, demanded care, and demanded that we look beyond reflections to see one another clearly, even when what we found there made us laugh softly, ache deeply, or weep for what might have been. Because in the end, what remained when the illusion was gone was not merely the answer, but the fragile human cost of believing too easily in what we think we see. Thank you so much for watching this story. Like and subscribe for more stories.